Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming back to the Hilltop and back to the Center for Presidential History. It's wonderful to see such a nice crowd here on a beautiful Wednesday evening. My name is Jeffrey Engel. I have the honor of directing the Center for Presidential History, and I hope you had the opportunity to see some of our student and postdoc and fellow accomplishments as rolling on the screens going by. We are really thrilled to be able to present these types of programs, of course, every month, and we're also thrilled to be able to do, well, any number of other things. So if you're not familiar with our organization, please do check out our website. We do travel tours, we do student tours, we do trips, we do a lot of fun stuff. But one of the fun things that we actually get to do especially is to have old and dear friends come and visit. And I would certainly put our speaker tonight in that category. Dr. Will Inboden, oh, I forgot something really important. Dr. Will Inboden did something that was really important that I'm going to mention first, which is he directed and worked on the dissertations as a committee member of two of our postdocs right now. Now, I want you all to appreciate that Will comes from the University of Texas, and I and Brian, our associate director, both have Texas A&M roots. So imagine how good these people had to be for me to hire them. Okay, but one of them in particular has some great news which I'm going to boast on. Augusta Delomo, I didn't ask if this was okay to say, so let's say it is. Her dissertation, wait, you're going to applaud in a second. Her dissertation just won the prize for being the single best dissertation at the University of Texas. Now, because it's the University of Texas, I have to point out, it's the University of Texas. But nonetheless, we're very pleased, and it's just another great example of how the people who come here to work on their materials after their doctoral experience really are the ones across the country who are teaching presidential history and American history, the people who are getting the jobs, and the people who are getting their books published. And certainly having won such a prestigious award, and I've read several of the chapters, it's really, really good. I know that we're going to have Augusta back here, I guess, 18 months from now, 2 years from now, for the book, 5, 6 years from now. We'll talk. We'll get somewhere in the middle there. But I have Will to thank for at least part of that, because he, of course, was served on Augusta's dissertation committee as a faculty member. And Will is, as I mentioned, an old friend. I was trying to remember when we first met, and I got depressed when I realized how large the number was. But he is educated at Stanford and at Yale. He is an expert in American foreign policy and in the religious aspect of American foreign policy as well. If you have the opportunity, I encourage you to pick up his first book, which explores that topic better than anyone that I can imagine. He also has spent time in the policymaking world, working at the NSC, working in the White House. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of people out there, probably myself included, who would tell you, oh yeah, I try to engage the policy world and the academic world. Most of them, like me, are lying. Will has actually done it. And so he brings a remarkable perspective to his study of Ronald Reagan. And as you know from seeing the book, it's a remarkable book, and he has some remarkable conclusions. And I am remarkably pleased to invite to the podium my good friend, Dr. Will Inboden.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. That was very kind. And Augusta and Ashland, it's great to have you here as well. Just consider this a accountability visit from your former dissertation committee members. So good to see you are still being productive researchers and scholars. Speaking of accountability, by the way, if that sounds like I'm checking in on a couple of my former PhD students, among my roles at the University of Texas, I'm the director of the Bill Clements Center for National Security there. And I know, of course, you have the wonderful Bill Clements Center for Southwestern History here. And one of my board members, Joel Roebuck, is here in the audience tonight, along with his wife, Linda. So I got to be on my best behavior, too, or else they will hear about it back in Austin. So, and of course, again, I want to return the thanks to my dear friend, Jeff Engel, a friend, a comrade, a fellow scholar and fellow traveler in so many ways. And we've been able to work on a number of projects together. A couple of edited volumes and conferences, and what you have in him and the Center for Presidential History here at SMU is really the gold standard for the study of the presidency, and it's a great privilege to be a part of it. All right, so I want to share a little bit about the how and why I put this book together the way I did, my book on the Reagan presidency and particularly his foreign policy, and then walk you through some of the main themes of the argument. And I hope this will be stimulating and of interest in its own right, particularly for those of you here in the room who might be enough of a vintage to remember the 1980s and the Reagan presidency. Of course, others of you, it will just be a distant history. I hope this will be of interest as well. So the first thing I want to say is I wrote this book as a narrative. All right, it is not a full-length biography of President Reagan. There's been some wonderful ones of those already done. It is just a focus on the 8 years of his presidency and foreign policy during those 8 years. But I wrote it as a narrative, as an unfolding story that proceeds chronologically. One, because I wanted to make it more interesting and readable, but especially because I wanted to show the importance of leadership, of human agency, of individual decision-making in the unfolding of a terribly difficult time for our country and for the world in the latter years and some of the most dangerous phases of the Cold War. And I wanted it to be a reminder that presidents have choices, that whoever is the president, whoever is in the Oval Office, that matters. Different ones might go in different directions. If there had been another one other than Reagan, there could have been any number of possibilities there. If Carter had won re-election, if Reagan hadn't gotten the nomination, if another Republican had won, or if John Hinckley Jr.'s bullet had been just another millimeter to the left in March of '81, which almost killed Reagan, and actually would have killed him. History could have proceeded differently. And so in writing the book as a narrative, I want the reader to come to a number of key crossroads, key decision points that Reagan has to make about how is he putting together his strategy for the Cold War. When is he going to emphasize pressure on the Soviet Union? When will he be emphasizing diplomatic outreach? And how is he going to manage this with a lot of other decisions to be making? The second reason I wrote it as a narrative is I want to recapture for readers the radical uncertainty of policy making. And here I do draw a little bit on my own time of previously working at the White House and the State Department in the George W. Bush administration. And the point is this: presidents, secretaries of state, they have a cascade of decisions coming into their inboxes every day. They have difficult choices to make, and they don't really know what the future holds. Now that I'm a scholar, a historian, we can look back and see what happened. We can all sit here today and we know how the story ends. Those of you who haven't read the book yet, I don't want to give away the ending, but the good guys win. All right, okay, is that the end? Okay, so the reason we're all sitting here today is we know how the story ends, right? The world is not destroyed in a nuclear apocalypse. The Soviet Union collapses peacefully. There is a spread of freedom and democracy in Central and Eastern Europe and around the world. But over time, I think something of a sense of inevitability creeps into a lot of us. We think, looking back, maybe the Cold War wasn't that bad. Maybe we really never were that close to nuclear destruction. The Soviet Union was always kind of a mess. Of course it was going to collapse peacefully, right? We can look back now and see that there were some structural factors in play. There were some mitigations against the risk of nuclear destruction. But President Reagan and his team didn't know that at the time. Every day he would go into the Oval Office with quite literally the sense that this could be the last day of planet Earth's existence, right? And I'm not being melodramatic there. Those of you who lived through this know that those were the stakes in the Cold War. And furthermore, he knew not only could this be the last day of planet Earth's existence, a lot of the question of whether planet Earth would continue to exist or not rested on decisions that he was going to be making and how those decisions were going to be perceived in the Kremlin. And decisions that they were going to be making as well. And so in writing the book as a narrative where you see events unfolding and I try to put you somewhat behind the desk in the Oval Office, you can see it's a reminder that Ronald Reagan didn't know for sure how the story was going to end. So he was trying to do his best. Every president was trying to do his best during these fraught years. But there was that uncertainty and knowing just how high the stakes were that I think needs to be recaptured. The third reason, and here again I also am drawing some on my previous time as a policymaker, is writing the book as a narrative can show the complexity and the interplay of different events. By which I mean, we can now look back and say, all right, I just want to study U.S.-Soviet relations in the 1980s and the arms control negotiations. That's a luxury that scholars have. That's a luxury that journalists sometimes have, too, as well. We can pick the one issue we want to go really deep on, and that's important, and that's how we come to deeper, richer understanding. But again, as I mentioned earlier, presidents can't pick and choose fully which issues they're going to pay attention to and which ones they're going to disregard, right? They have dozens of decisions demanding their time and attention every single day on big issues, small issues, very public, embarrassing issues, very private, confidential, top secret, classified issues. And in the midst of Reagan trying to work out his strategy towards the Soviets and adapt to how they were responding and navigate the perilous waters of the Cold War, he was also dealing with American hostages being taken by terrorist groups, multiple wars breaking out in the Middle East, fierce trade tensions, almost a trade war with Japan, very difficult civil wars, and the really difficult questions about apartheid in southern Africa, other terrorist attacks going on around the world, tensions with Congress. And I'm not even mentioning his domestic politics or economic policies or things too. So he's dealing with what his Secretary of State George Shultz called the simultaneity of events, all of these things at once. And to fully appreciate what he was trying to do with the Cold War, you also have to understand all of those other issues demanding his time and attention, and how he acted on those would often shape how he would respond to others. And just to give you a couple of, just one particular example of this simultaneity of events, many of you will no doubt remember that awful day in October of 1983 when the Hezbollah terrorist suicide bomber blew up the Marine barracks in Beirut, killed 241 American Marines. It's the worst loss of life from Marines in a single day since Iwo Jima 40 years earlier. Another of you may also remember that the only time Reagan deploys ground troops in combat during his presidency is invading the Caribbean island of Grenada. When there had been a Marxist coup that had taken over, the Soviets and Cubans were building a military airstrip there. There are about 600 American medical students there who are at risk of being taken hostage, and so he does that invasion. What we forget, though, is those two events happened on the same weekend. Those two events happened within 24 hours of each other. And it was just a couple weeks before that the Soviets had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, and meanwhile the United States was about to undertake the Able Archer exercise with our NATO allies, one of the biggest and most fraught military exercises of the war. So all these things are happening at once. That's what I mean about the simultaneity of events, that a president cannot just sit back and say, all right, it's October, so it's going to be Middle East Peace Process Month, and I'm not going to do anything else with anything else in the world. It's only about Middle East Peace Process for October. Sorry, it just doesn't work that way. And then finally, writing the book the way I did, I'm trying to recapture the role of personality, of human relationships, of individual people. Reagan and his cabinet are a very talented, colorful, very, very driven, fascinating collection of people, most of whom also hated each other's guts, right? And so the leaking, the feuding, the bureaucratic infighting, every presidency has it. This one really had it. And again, you cannot understand the policies themselves or the policy outcomes without looking at all of that bureaucratic messiness and the feuding and the fighting. And some of these feuds go back decades, right? Some of them they're kind of refighting fights they may have had back in the Vietnam era, or even differences going back to World War II. And so, writing the book is an unfolding story. You can see the human factor in there, the passions, the vanities, as well as the nobility and the deep bonds of friendship that many of them develop too. Okay, turning to the story itself. Well, the vast majority of the book is about those 8 years of the presidency. We need to understand a little bit of the backdrop about just what does the United States look like and what does the world look like on January 20th of 1981 when Reagan raises his right hand and takes the oath of office as the new American president. Well, again, those of you in a certain vintage in here, I don't need to remind you of this. The 1970s were a pretty lousy decade, right? It was not a great run for the United States. It was not a great run for the world. And I'm not just talking about disco, all right, and really bad polyester pants, okay? So bring me back for the talk on 70s music, all right? So that'll be another one. No. The 1970s, right on up to the day that Reagan is sworn in, was a very challenging time for our country and for the world. And there were 5 different crises, all take place over the course of the 1970s, all interacting with each other, fueling each other, producing the United States as a very weakened, divided, demoralized country. What were those crises? The first is the military crisis. Our military was still dealing with the aftermath of the first lost war in our history, in the Vietnam War. The day that Reagan takes the oath of office is 8 years, almost to the day. It's like 8 years and 24 hours after the last American combat troop had left Vietnam. Okay, so Vietnam is not history. Vietnam is yesterday, right? Vietnam is still and it's only less than 6 years after South Vietnam had actually fallen to the north, right? And so coming out of that, this is the first time our country, our military has lost a war in our history. You've also got the transition from the draft to the all-volunteer force. The post-Watergate Congress, post-Vietnam Congress, further slashes in military spending. And so the military is very weak and underfunded and demoralized. The second crisis, related to the first, is a foreign policy crisis, an international policy crisis. And it may seem strange now since we know how the Cold War ends, but if you were to do an overall net assessment or keep a scorecard in the Cold War in the year 1980, 1981, it'd be pretty clear to most observers the Soviet Union was winning, the Soviet bloc was winning, and the United States, the free world, the non-communist bloc was losing, right? So Soviet Union is at or near the apex of their military power at this point, and I emphasize military power because I want to come back to some of their other weaknesses. At the apex of their military power, and communism had a really good run. All right, so just in the past 8 years, the previous 8 years before Reagan becomes president, South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Mozambique, Angola, South Yemen, Nicaragua, Grenada, Afghanistan, all had fallen to communism. Now, each of those stories has its own particular complexities, right? It has some of its local factors and so on and so forth. But in each case, these were not free, fair, open democratic elections. In each case, there had been the use of force by Kremlin-sponsored communist forces to take over the government and install a communist government. And so it seemed to be on every continent around the world that the Soviet bloc, the communist bloc, was ascendant, and non-communist governments were in decline. And of course, you have the Iran hostage crisis as well, right? So it's not just about things are not looking so good in the Cold War. Iran had, the Shah had fallen in 1979 to the revolutionary Shia government, which had then taken 52 American diplomats, Marines, and spies hostage, and then held them hostage for 444 days. Humiliates the United States, cripples the Carter presidency, and seems to further telegraph to the world a weakened and demoralized and ineffective America. So that's the foreign policy crisis. Then, of course, there's the energy crisis, right? Starting with the 1973 Yom Kippur War and then the OPEC oil embargo. The United States was not producing near as much oil and gas then as we are now, so we were much more dependent on foreign sources. That was a real vulnerability for us. And again, this leads, of course, to personal misery for many Americans, hours-long lines at gas stations to fill up the tank. Deep damage to the American economy, and also, again, it further seems to symbolize American weakness and ineptitude. The energy crisis, the third one. Then there's the economic crisis, right? You've got this phenomenon of stagflation. High unemployment, low growth, high inflation. President Ford hadn't been able to whip it. President Carter hadn't been able to either. And a growing sense among a lot of Americans, maybe our market economy itself is so fundamentally flawed and broken that we just can't get back to growth again. And again, there's a lot of complex factors that go into this, but this is just further reinforcing for the rest of the world. And by the way, the weak American economy also has knock-on effects, especially for a number of our European allies who also have their own economic troubles. So it seems to be like a larger crisis of the economies of the Western world. All this leads to the fifth crisis, the crisis of national morale. Our country did not believe in itself anymore. And a lot of the rest of the world didn't believe in us either, right? The sense of any sort of distinctiveness or exceptionalism, whatever you want to call it, something dynamic and vibrant and strong and optimistic about the United States, our system of government, our values, our role in the world. We just didn't believe in it anymore. And we had good reasons not to believe it, right? Just look at those other 4 crises I was walking you through. So these are the different crises that Reagan inherits when he takes the oath of office. And what is that office that he is now coming to occupy, President of the United States? Well, the presidency itself had its own almost 6th crisis, okay? A lot of Americans at the time thought the presidency was broken, and they had good reason to. You know, a general rule of thumb we might use for a successful presidency is, can that president complete 2 terms in office, right? Can you run and win, and then serve 4 years and run for re-election and get re-elected and serve those remaining 4 years, right? I'm not getting into any particular policies, right? But that, generally, if you look at the really successful American presidencies by any metric, usually they were able to serve 2 terms. When Reagan takes office, the last president to complete 2 terms was Eisenhower. Right, Eisenhower. So you young people, look him up on Wikipedia. He was a former president. So anyway, sorry. So important guy, okay? Since then, we had 5 succeeding presidencies, none of whom had been able to complete 2 terms. Kennedy, killed by an assassin. LBJ forgoes re-election because of Vietnam, right? A real humiliation. Very rare for a president to willfully choose not to run again, but he's crippled by Vietnam. He's lost his party. He's lost the country. Nixon leaves office in disgrace over the Watergate scandal. His unelected Vice President Ford, who was only there because Spiro Agnew had been forced from office by a scandal, serves 2.5 years. Certainly a very high-minded, honorable man, does his best, but can't win election, can't win re-election, right? Carter only serves 1 term. So there's a very real sense that the presidency itself is broken, that this institution just doesn't have the power, the prestige, the capability, whatever it takes for any one man, maybe eventually one woman, to be able to wield these powers successfully and deal with all these crises. And so it's not just that the country and the world seem like a mess. There's a sense of, it used to be in the past, we'd look to a president, you know, where's our FDR? Where's our Lincoln? Where's the president who can come along in a time of global and national crisis and occupy this office and wield the powers of the office and lead the nation and heal the nation and restore us to a better path. So I emphasize all this because you know my book overall gives a pretty favorable portrayal of Reagan and his presidency and his policies. But I think the more you look at it, the more remarkable it becomes. Like, he did not inherit a very good hand. Any successful politician will have some amount of luck, and Reagan certainly has his share of luck. But you can't ascribe all of it to luck. And it looked at the time like he did not have much luck at all. Okay, turning now to his main concern, the Cold War. And again, as I mentioned before, the book deals with Asia policy and Middle East policy and counterterrorism, a lot of other stuff. I'm not going to talk much more about that tonight. If you're curious about that, read the book, please. But the main animating theme of the book is the main animating theme of Reagan's main concern, foreign policy concern as president, and that is the Cold War. And here's where I also want to argue for a rather revolutionary shift that he engineers in America's approach to the Cold War. The Cold War, its origins are much disputed and much murky, but the general consensus is that it starts in the late 1940s under President Harry Truman, who I think was a great president, by the way. And so every Cold War president, from Truman on forward to Carter, Democrats and Republicans, had conceived of the Cold War. They all had their differences, okay, but I'm oversimplified here. They had all primarily conceived of the Cold War as a great power competition. You got the large, powerful United States with a large military and a large economy, and you've got the large, powerful Soviet Union with a large military and a large economy. That's a rough, simple definition of great power competition. That's how they'd conceived of the Cold War. It's a great power competition between these two rival power blocks. That happens to be a battle of ideas, right? We also have these tensions because they're communist and we're capitalist, right? Or they're totalitarian and we're democratic. So each of those presidents had seen that dimension of the Cold War. But for them, it's primarily a great power competition, and therefore, what do you do with the Soviet Union? Well, you have the strategy of containment, all right? Which is that we need to contain the Soviet Union and prevent them from getting too much more powerful, expanding too much further. The Soviet Union is a rival power to be contained. So no previous American president had wanted to encourage Soviet advances or anything like that. Like, they all didn't like the Soviet Union. They all wanted to stop any further Soviet expansion. But they did not pay much attention or concern to internal conditions within the Soviet Union. They just assumed, look, the Soviet Union, it's been around for 70 years. It's been there since 1917. It is a permanent fixture on the geopolitical landscape, right? We may not like it. It's a challenge. It's a problem for us, but it's been around for a long time, and it's going to continue to be around for a long time. And so it's a rival nation to be contained. That was the general approach. Reagan reverses this. He has a very different theory of the case on the Cold War, and it starts with this. He sees the Cold War as primarily a battle of ideas that happens to be a great power competition, right? So he agrees with the others it's a great power competition. They agree with him there's a battle of ideas, but he puts the battle of ideas part first and the great power competition part second. What's that look like in practice? He sees Soviet communism as a vile idea to be defeated, not a rival nation to be contained. Okay, and that's where you see a very different change of direction in his overall Cold War strategy and framework. This also means, by the way, that he does not accept the Soviet Union as a permanent fixture on the geopolitical landscape, a country, a system that's always been there and always will be there. He actually sees it as more weak and vulnerable and potentially even defeatable. And that's why, at one point early on in the campaign, he's asked by one of his staff, what's your approach in the Cold War? And he says, well, he said, a lot of things seem complex, but we boil them down, they're pretty simple. My theory of the Cold War is we win, they lose. Okay. Now, this is a great line, right? Reagan's great with these great lines. 4 words there, and he totally reframes the Cold War. And it sounds a little jingoistic in some ways, but I hope, as you heard, as I was trying to lay out the broader 40-year context of American strategy, there's actually a fairly profound shift going on in we win, so that actually means that there's a possibility of the United States prevailing, not just managing the problem, but prevailing. They lose, a possibility of the Soviet Union actually collapsing. Nobody else talked that way, or very few did, at least, right? This is a very radical, different idea to take. Now, that is the, if you will, aggressive, assertive part of Reagan's approach to the Soviet Union and the Cold War. But there's another really important part of this that needs to be appreciated. He was very committed to keeping the Cold War cold. What I mean by that, he didn't want a hot war with the Soviets. He did not want a nuclear war. He did not want to destroy the whole world. He did not want to destroy, massacre all the people of Russia and the Soviet republics. He certainly didn't want that to happen to his country too. And so even as he is looking for ways to increase the pressure on the Soviet Union, to defeat it, if you will, he wants to do it in a way that avoids World War III, right? Quite literally, whether a hot conventional war in Europe or certainly a nuclear war. And so this is one of the puzzles that I wrestled with over the many years of researching and writing this book is, I know Reagan wants to avoid nuclear war and keep the Cold War cold. I also know he wants to defeat the Soviet Union. Those things are both very clear in the record. How do you square all that? And the best way I could come up with, and this is my words, not his, but I would think and hope this is a fairly faithful summary of what he was trying to do. His goal in the Cold War with the Soviet Union is a negotiated surrender, right? So he wants a surrender. He wants them defeated, okay? He's a child of the World War II generation when, our goal with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan was unconditional surrender. He likes that surrender part. He wants them to surrender. But negotiated is also really important. From the outset, he's very committed to diplomacy, to negotiations with the Soviets. He knows that negotiations and diplomacy are going to be key to managing and reducing the risk of nuclear war and finding some sort of peaceful solution to this conflict. And elsewhere, he talks about my goal is to end the Cold War, right? So he wants to win the Cold War and he wants to end the Cold War. And there's a lot of tension between those two. And sometimes he errs one way and sometimes he errs the other way. And there's a lot of risk with those that you might find yourself just in this paradoxical situation where your policies become contradictory. I think at the end of the day, and I argue in the book, that he was able to balance those two goals. And I think the results there speak for themselves. Now, one other thing that it's important to say is Reagan saw the Soviet Union, I mentioned he saw it as vulnerable, he thought it actually could be defeated, but he saw it as this very peculiar and dangerous combination of strong and weak. He thought that the Soviet military was very strong, and he was right about that. Certainly in the first couple years of his presidency, that's one reason why he's very committed to the military buildup, the defense modernization, to deter the Soviets, to let them know you can't, you won't be able to defeat the United States. It will not serve you well to launch a preemptive war. But he also sees them otherwise as very weak. He sees their economy as weak. He sees their political system as weak. He often points out, like, look, they span 11 time zones. They have the largest agriculture reserves in the world, and they can't even feed their own people, right? That's why they have to buy American grain from American farmers. And in any number of other ways. He was very focused on the plight of religious and political dissidents. He would often point out, look, there's something perverse about a system. There's certainly something very weak about a system that has to devote so many billions of rubles and thousands of or tens of thousands of people, KGB officers and others, to controlling and monitoring its own people, right? That it doesn't have the strength and confidence to allow its own people to have a voice in their government, but instead needs to oppress them. Especially something weak about a system that wants to enforce atheism on its own people, especially with, of course, the historic Russian Orthodox Church. So he sees the Soviet Union as this unique combination of strong and weak, militarily strong, but otherwise weak across a number of domains. And that, of course, is actually quite dangerous. Why? Think of it as a wounded, cornered bear, right? It's still a bear, can still mess you up pretty bad, got those claws, those teeth, On the other hand, it's wounded, and it's cornered, and it's vulnerable. And so his challenge is, how do you keep the bear cornered, and how do you further weaken it, but how do you not provoke it so much that it does lash out, and then you have a hot war? It's also very important to stress, and again, in hindsight, we can see a lot of ways he was correct about his diagnosis of the Soviet Union, but it was not widely accepted at all at the time by expert opinion, including many within his own government. And this is, like I said, why I wanted to go back and write the book in a way that you could see what the world looked and felt like at the time, what the available options seemed to be, and what the conventional wisdom, what the expert opinion was at the time. So just a couple of examples. At the end of 1982, in the journal Foreign Affairs, a very prestigious, credible journal, in some ways the House organ for the foreign policy establishment. Two of America's premier Soviet scholars from a couple of Ivy League universities, who will go nameless here, write an article analyzing Reagan's Soviet policies. And he's been president for 2 years now, so they've had a couple years to watch this guy. And meanwhile, these two scholars have spent their lifetime studying the Soviet Union, and they'd visited there many, many times. And here's what they say. In the article, they denounce Reagan's shrill and incendiary rhetoric. They dismiss his belief in the Kremlin's vulnerability as profoundly erroneous, and they condemn his entire strategy as doomed to fail. This is what they say. Even if the West were able to impose extreme economic choices on the Soviet Union, the system would not crumble, the political structures would not disintegrate, the economy would not go bankrupt, the elites and leadership would not lose their will and power to rule internally and to aspire externally to the status of a global power. Well, you could not be more wrong than that. But this is not just a couple of cranks, right? This is a couple of our country's leading Soviet experts in the pages of Foreign Affairs. But that's outside government, right? That's scholars. Well, we scholars, we get things wrong all the time. What about Reagan's own intelligence community? The CIA with its billions of dollars of funding and its thousands of experts who do nothing else but study the Soviet Union. In 1983, the CIA's top Soviet analyst writes this. He's aware that Reagan is trying to pursue the strategy to bring the Soviet Union to a collapse, and he said, that's completely wrong. The Soviet Union is going to be with us for years to come. The U.S.-Soviet Cold War will still be confronting our grandchildren, right? So he writes that in 1983, essentially saying that at least, 2 generations from now, another 50 years from now, the Soviet Union will still be there, the Cold War will still be here. The Soviet challenge is not going to disappear as a result of its own weaknesses or the brilliance of this or that American policy initiative, right? So very direct, on one hand, it's kind of good that the CIA is able to say what it really thinks. It's not politicized intelligence or telling the president, we think you're wrong about everything, but also telling that this is their top Soviet analyst, and this is his assessment. Okay, maybe you're thinking, all right, well, Inboden, that's 1983, but a few years later, everyone can see how weak and vulnerable the Soviet Union is. Not really. April of 1987, this is the last one I'm going to give you. Reagan's now been president for 6.5 years, right? Gorbachev has been in power for a couple years. Perestroika, glasnost. It seems like there is a thaw coming in the Cold War, and surely everybody can see how weak and vulnerable and fragile the Soviet economy is on the precipice of collapse. Well, not really. The White House asked the CIA to do a special assessment saying, all right, Reagan's strategy for 6.5 years has been to do this military buildup, to put economic pressure on the Soviets, to lure them into an arms race that they cannot sustain, that their economy cannot sustain. How's that going? So CIA tasked its very best team of analysts. They spend a few months on this. They produce about a 50-page report, recently declassified, on this very question. Is the American military buildup putting economic pressure on the Soviet Union? And the answer is no. The Soviet Union, the Soviet economy grew by 3% last year in 1986, they say. We now know those numbers were just made up by the Soviets. And then they say the Soviet economy is vested with great crude strength from its enormous base. It remains a viable system capable of producing huge quantities of goods and services annually, especially for industrial and military applications. Anyway, so I could give you dozens of others of those. I won't do that. But the point being, expert opinion had a pretty clear consensus on the strength and durability and viability of the Soviet system, and Reagan had a very, very different take. In hindsight, I think he was correct, but that was not what the prevailing view was at the time. All right, so what does he do to actually implement this new strategy of trying to pursue a negotiated surrender? We win, they lose. Well, it has these two prongs of pressure and outreach, and I'll unpack those a little bit more. But those are the two ones to keep in mind: is dramatically increasing pressure on the Soviet system across all elements of national power, but also extending the hand of outreach. Of diplomacy, of hoping for negotiations, of looking to keep the Cold War cold. So first, the pressure prongs, the military one. I mentioned this earlier. But the key thing to understand about Reagan's defense buildup is it's more than just a buildup, right? Yes, he throws a lot more money at the Pentagon. And by the way, he has bipartisan support for that, right? So in 1981, when he first proposes, about a 15% increase in military spending. It passes both houses of Congress by something like 95% yes in favor, 5% against. The Democrats also overwhelmingly. There's a broad consensus here that we have terribly neglected our military. So he has bipartisan support for that. But it's not just about throwing more money at the Pentagon. Rather, if you look more carefully, Reagan has a more deliberate strategy here, and he himself mentions this a few times. It's not just the numbers of tanks and planes and ships and all that we're building, although the numbers matter. It's the types. And his goal is not just to outspend and outbuild the Soviets, it's to outsmart them. Right? And what that means is he's a great believer in American technology and innovation. And remember, he'd been two-term governor of California in the 60s and 70s during the first big boom of Silicon Valley, right? So he had a front row seat. He'd in some ways presided over the Silicon Valley boom. And now he doesn't come up with all these weapon systems himself, but if you look at, in more detail, and we can talk about this in Q&A if you'd like, at the types of weapon systems, the types of new planes, the types of tanks, the types of new submarines, the technology behind them that he's building, it's all designed to be so much more qualitatively advanced than the weapons that the Soviets have, that it doesn't matter how many the Soviets are going to have or how many rubles they throw at it, they can't match us in quality. All right, and that's the key. That's the key principle there. The second prong of pressure is the ideological one. This is, as I said, he believes the Cold War is primarily a battle of ideas, and he's committed to waging that battle of ideas. And that in turn means two things. One, he wants to delegitimize Soviet communism. He wants to tell the truth about its contradictions, its barbarisms, its depredations, its viciousness. But he also in turn wants to lift up the positive alternative of the free world, of democratic capitalism, of market economies and self-government and free political systems, to show not just that, hey, living under communism is a lousy deal and that people are impoverished and oppressed and unhappy, but rather those who live in free societies are prosperous and happy and have more opportunity and a more optimistic outlook on their future. And so even people who know nothing else about Reagan, they'll say, wait a minute, wasn't he the guy who said evil empire? Wasn't he the guy who said tear down this wall? Yes, he was, right? You do remember those things. But if you look more carefully at his speeches, if you read his major foreign policy speeches in sequence, and if you read the context for them, and if you also appreciate that he had his personal hand was very involved in these, he's not just reading the scripts written by his speechwriters, but he himself is writing great swaths of these speeches, you see something a little more interesting, which is a sustained argument trying to delegitimize Soviet communism as a system and point to a better way. So this is why in 1981, he goes to Notre Dame to give the commencement address. He does this very self-consciously. Carter had given his first major foreign policy speech at Notre Dame in 1977, a commencement address where he'd warned against the inordinate fear of communism. And in context, Carter had some reasonable concerns there, right? But Reagan wants to deliver a very, very different message. And so that's where he says, the West won't just contain communism. Remember, he's not just doing this containment thing anymore. He says, rather, we will transcend communism as some bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written. The next year, he goes to London, first American president in history invited to Westminster to address both houses of Parliament, the Commons and the Lords. And that's where he, among other things, and this is how I open the book, he says, Marxism, Leninism will end up on the ash heap of history. Now, for those of you who have studied Marxist ideology, I'm sorry. No, all right, more seriously. For those of you who have, that a cardinal tenet of it is the historical dialectic, is the belief in the inevitability of the triumph of the working class and then a classless society, okay? And so a core tenet of Soviet ideology was a belief that history is marching our way and will inevitably triumph. And so what Reagan's doing there, it's not just a schoolyard taunt, he's trying to turn Marxist ideology on its head. The next year, he says, they are the focus of evil in the modern world, and they are an evil empire. All right, and again, he's widely remembered for that. In the West, in the United States, everyone was very worked up. We can't believe he used the word evil. Why would you say that about that system? The Kremlin was also very upset. Not because he called them evil, well, they didn't like that, but because he called them an empire. Again, another tenet of Marxist ideology is it's the capitalists who are the imperialists, right? It's the capitalists who engage in imperialism and the rapacious search for further markets and more working classes to exploit and so on and so forth. And so for him to call the Soviet Union an empire was also kind of hitting them right where they were most ideological vulnerable, right where it hurt, because their whole critique of the West for the previous 7 decades had been they're the imperialists and we are the anti-imperialists. Why does he call them an empire? Well, because they were occupying and controlling Central and Eastern Europe, right? Because they were trying to foment and spread armed revolution around the world, classic imperialism. Anyway, I could go on, but the point being, if you look at his speeches in sequence, you see a sustained argument to delegitimize Soviet communism. This is the ideological pressure on them. Third, human rights, democracy, religious freedom. Let's put this kind of basket of human freedoms and liberties in one particular bundle here. As I mentioned earlier, he also saw it as a real vulnerability of the Soviet system that it invested so many resources in oppressing and monitoring and controlling its own people. That it has the Gulag, right? That it has the KGB, and it especially offended him and outraged him that they would enforce atheism on all their people. Reagan himself is a very devout Christian, and he believes that it's sort of kind of innate to our being as human beings that we want to worship the divine, that we want to have some sort of transcendent connection. And so he's fine with civil liberties for atheists, but he's really offended at any totalitarian system that would enforce atheism and oppress its religious believers like that. So this is why he invests tremendous diplomatic capital advocating on behalf of Soviet Jews who are trying to just have the right to the freedom to emigrate to Israel and to the United States. Why he makes a huge priority of getting these 7 Siberian Pentecostals released who are holed up in the basement of the U.S. Embassy. A very interesting episode in its own right. And doing every time he'd meet with Gorbachev, or every time he would have Secretary of State Schultz meet with a Soviet leader, the Soviets would want to talk about arms control and trade. And Reagan and Schultz would always say, we're not talking about that till we talk about human rights, democracy, religious freedom, and here's a list of 20 or 30 Gulag prisoners that we want to see released. So they do that out of a humanitarian sense, but also because for them it highlights the illegitimacy of this system. And they wanted to be very clear. Reagan and Secretary Schultz wanted to be very clear. Our enemy is Soviet communism, the system. Our enemy is not the Soviet people, right? They are our friends. They are victims of this system too. They are not our enemies. And we want them to know that the United States is on their side, insofar as their side is aspirations to have the freedom to think and talk and breathe and to assemble and to seek a better life for themselves. The other prong, the fourth prong, economic pressure. And this was a more complicated one for him because the United States did not have very deep economic ties with the Soviet Union. But as Reagan had seen the vulnerabilities in the Soviet economy, one way he wants to bring that economic pressure, of course, is with the military buildup. He knew that they were spending way too much on their own military. He would often say the Soviets liked the arms race a lot better when they were the only ones running in it, right? So he wants the United States to be running in this arms race now too. But he knew that one of their only sources of hard currency came from their oil and gas exports. And so this is why he first tries to sanction a European pipeline, which was going to be providing a lot of European money to buy Soviet gas. That doesn't go so well because our European allies don't like it. But meanwhile, Reagan does persuade our European allies to quit providing below market loan credits to the Soviets and to the Warsaw Pact, and then he eventually helps persuade the Saudis to increase their oil outputs to crash the price of oil. This was not good for the Texas economy in the late 1980s, as some of you will remember, but it also inflicted extreme pain on the Soviet economy, right? Because there's only so much oil they can be producing, and when the price goes down to $8 a barrel, they're now losing something like $20 billion a year, right? So economic pressure to accelerate these economic contradictions within their own system. And then finally, allies. Reagan is, I think, the American president in the modern era who most values and is most committed to American allies. Now, our alliance system is relatively, like I said, it's a post-World War II creation. You know, NATO founded in 1949. Our Asian allies, we codified those in the early 1950s. And every, from Truman on forward, Reagan's other predecessors had also valued our allies and seen them as a source of strength, but Reagan even more so. And part of it is, something of an amateur student of history. He realizes that the United States is really the only power in world history to have ever had voluntary allies, right? Allies who chose that they wanted to be in these security treaties with us, that they actually welcomed our forces being based in Germany or the United Kingdom or Japan. Now, obviously, a lot of this is the product of the unique circumstances after World War II, but the 1980s is absolutely clear. And he also knows that the Soviet Union doesn't have a single voluntary ally, right? Poland was not voluntarily a Soviet ally. East Germany was not voluntarily a Soviet ally. They were coerced. And so he sees this as a unique asymmetric American advantage and source of strength. And so he invests tremendous amounts of his own personal capital and time in these relationships with allies. This is why he builds that friendship with Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister Nakasone of Japan, Chancellor Helmut Kohl of West Germany, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney of Canada, Pope John Paul as well, right? Not a formal nation state, but still an important ally, at least as an anti-communist partner. Now, the book will tell you it's a complicated story. Allies drive Reagan nuts. He drives them nuts. There's a lot of frictions. There's real differences too. Okay, oftentimes these allied partnerships are like a bad marriage. They're fighting all the time, but they're still married, and they're staying married. They still have that fundamental commitment to each other. But he always thought the United States was better with allies than without them. And this is not just for nostalgic photo ops on the White House South Lawn or when he visits these foreign capitals. The United States gets real tangible Cold War benefits out of this. Japan, under coaxing and encouraging from Reagan, triples its defense spending over 8 years and extends its own maritime defense perimeter out 1,000 miles, right? We could talk more about the details, but this means Japan kind of opens up an entire new front in the Cold War, putting pressure on the Soviets in their own Far East. One of the most successful intelligence partnerships of the Cold War is between the United States and France. France trusted, even though we have other tensions with France, they trust us so much. Very effective covert action we do jointly with the French that ends up costing the Soviets billions of dollars in technologies that we're sabotaging. And of course, the British and West Germans and Italians and Belgians all agree to allow American intermediate-range nuclear missiles to be deployed on their soil. Thatcher and Kohl risk their own re-election over this because it's part of Reagan's pressure campaign to put those missiles there to counter the Soviet missiles that are also in the Soviet Union targeting those European capitals, to allies. Okay, then the final few minutes on the outreach part, and then I'll wrap this up. I wanted you to see the full spectrum of pressure because it makes, I think, Reagan's outreach and especially the relationship that he builds with Gorbachev in the second term all the more notable, okay? Because it's not just that these two guys get along and build an important partnership, it's that they do that in the same context of their systems being mortal adversaries and Reagan trying to bring Gorbachev's system to collapse. First important point of context to appreciate is Reagan is the first president in the entire Cold War, going back to Truman himself, who does not meet with his Soviet counterpart at all during his first term. All right, so there had become a custom and expectation of symmetry throughout the Cold War. Every previous president had done it. You got to meet with your Soviet counterpart. Reagan is interested in that. He writes letters to Brezhnev. He meets with the Soviet ambassador. He writes letters to Andropov and Chernenko. But he also wants to jettison the previous Cold War orthodoxy, which he thought, somewhat fairly, had amounted to symmetry for its own sake, meetings for their own sake, talking for its own sake. And he says, look, I want to meet with these guys. I want to negotiate with them, but I want to accomplish real things. I'm not just interested in the photo ops, and I don't want to let the Soviets get the propaganda value of meeting with the American president without delivering real results. So he comes under tremendous heat and criticism in his first term for not meeting with his Soviet counterparts. And again, it's part of this broader strategy. He wants to, but he wants to do it when he feels like he and the United States can negotiate from a position of strength. Now, there's also the challenge, of course, which he puts very well. I mentioned Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko. Those are the three Soviet leaders of his first term. They die about 12 months apart from each other. And at one point late in '84, he's asked, why won't you meet with a Soviet leader? And he says, I want to, but they keep dying on me. And they did keep dying on him, right? But in a way that symbolized some of the broader decrepitude and sclerosis and rot in the Soviet system, that it couldn't even produce a healthy, vigorous leader, capable of meeting with an American counterpart. And this is why, when Gorbachev comes to power in March of 1985, it is such a seminal moment. It is so significant. Now, one of the more controversial aspects of my book and my argument, which I think I'm onto something, but I'll put it out there and you can make of it what you will, is I think it's pretty clear that beginning in his very first year in office, part of Reagan's pressure strategy in the Soviet Union, it's not just to weaken them, it's not just to deter them from attacking the United States or allies, it's to strengthen the reformist impulses within the Soviet system, and even he hopes to produce a reformist leader that he can negotiate with. Let me be clear, I'm not saying that Reagan dictates to the Politburo, you will select Gorbachev and he will be my reform partner. No, he does not have that power. Gorbachev is largely selected as a product of internal Soviet dynamics. But he's also selected by a Politburo that sees the world as all of a sudden not going their way so well, that is in a system that's feeling more and more pressure, more and more of a desperate need to reform. And meanwhile, you've got this American president over there who's kind of looking and waiting and hoping that they'll pick a reformist leader. And so I titled that chapter in my book, Waiting for Gorbachev, because Reagan had been waiting for a Gorbachev, right? A reformist Soviet leader. And that's one reason why he embraces Gorbachev a lot earlier than most. So just as a lot of conventional wisdom had said, oh, the Soviets are going to be strong and durable and viable, and Reagan is nuts to think that they're weak. There's also a lot of conventional wisdom, especially among Reagan's own conservative Republican base, saying, you can't trust this Gorbachev guy. He's not a real reformer. He's just like all those other Soviet leaders. And in hindsight, that's clearly wrong. I mean, Gorbachev, I think, becomes a really heroic figure. He becomes an essential partner for Reagan, just as Reagan is an essential partner for him. He is a genuine reformer. But again, in the context of the time, we need to remember, the Soviet Union had been around since 1917. They'd never really ever selected a truly reformist leader before, right? Maybe Khrushchev in 53 after Stalin dies. We won't go into all the Sovietology. He starts off as a reformer, but then he's the dude who puts those missiles in Cuba, right? I mean, he then brings the Cold War to arguably its most dangerous moment. He turns out to be much more aggressive and bellicose. And so we'd never really seen a true Soviet reformer before come out of the system. And so there were good reasons to be a little bit skeptical of Gorbachev, which makes it all the more notable, I think, how Reagan senses in him something, no, there's a genuine commitment here to reducing the threat of nuclear war and to putting the Cold War on a more peaceful trajectory. And so this is why, if you read the transcripts of his 4 summit meetings with Gorbachev, Geneva in 85, Reykjavik in 86, Washington, D.C. in 87, Moscow in 1988, you see some very tense, acrimonious exchanges, right? Gorbachev threatening to blow up the United States in a nuclear war, these guys shouting, erupting at each other, swearing at each other. But you also see some really tender, touching moments. You see Reagan appealing to Gorbachev in their first meeting saying, you and I together hold the fate of the world in our hands. And that is a terrifying responsibility. This is not grandiosity, right? This is not, hey, how powerful we are. This is appealing to his common humanity. And you see Gorbachev saying, absolutely, and we've got to do something about this, right? And so, one's an American, one's a Soviet. They're both very loyal to their own systems, but they're also both human beings, and they're also both world leaders, and they also come to really, genuinely care for each other. And it's part of that trust building between the two of them that enables them to arrive at some very remarkable agreements, most notably the INF Treaty abolishing an entire class of nuclear weapons, which they signed in December of 1987. But that comes from trust, and also comes from both of them being willing to take real political risks for their own bases. With Gorbachev, it eventually, cost him his job. That's a little more of a complicated story there, right? And Reagan takes a lot of heat from his own base too. So much so, and I will close with these 2 little vignettes, that reading the transcripts of their final summit together in Moscow in May of 1988. There's, like I said, there's a truly genuine friendship that's been built at this point. They're still talking about further reductions in nuclear arms. They're talking about reducing ICBMs. They're talking about getting Soviet troops out of Afghanistan. There's plenty of policy differences. They have things they're working through. But like I said, these are also 2 guys who have generally come to care for and like each other. And one of their final meetings together, Reagan says, all right, no more of the policy stuff. I want to talk to you very personally. And Reagan shares kind of his own grief with Gorbachev that Reagan's son, Ron, is an atheist. And Reagan says, Mikhail, I'm also very worried that you're an atheist. And speaking as your friend, I just really hope you will come to know the meaning and purpose that comes from a relationship with God. And he goes on for quite a bit of time about this, right? And whatever else your own religious beliefs may be, as a historical matter, this is very unusual. Heads of nuclear armed superpower enemy states don't spend time in deep, intense, personal, spiritual discussions, especially sharing about their own grief about a family member who may have strayed from the family faith. And Gorbachev is a little taken back at this, but he also is very touched by it. He can see, wait a minute, this American president, he seems to genuinely care for me, even cares for my soul. Now, I don't believe I have a soul. I'm an atheist. That's set that aside, right? This is what I mean about the depth of the friendship that there is between them. And so I will just close with this. June of 2004, Reagan dies. His body is lying in state in the casket in the Capitol Rotunda in Washington. I was there at the time. The lines of mourners and those there to honor him are miles and miles long. It's a very noteworthy aspect of our country's history. A very powerful episode. And then Gorbachev pays a surprise visit. He flies there from Moscow. He's, of course, been out of power for 13 years. The Soviet Union had long collapsed. He's now a private citizen. But he pays a surprise visit. The Secret Service usher him up to the front of the line. They ask others to go away. And then Gorbachev goes up to Reagan's casket. And you can see the YouTube video of this. And he kind of bows his head. He rubs it. He has a very touching, quiet moment there. And he's walking out, and a reporter asks him, Mr. Gorbachev, why are you here? What did you do? And he says, well, I wanted to come pay tribute to my friend, President Reagan. He was a great leader, and at the right moment, he became a peacemaker. So, thank you very much. All right, Q&A, yes?
Thank you, Will. That was as wonderful as expected. We are going to have some moments for a Q&A, and Will's going to run the Q&A himself. Yeah. But if you would please wait till the microphone gets to you, because the microphone goes into the recording. And if you want your words preserved for posterity, you have to talk into the mic.
Yeah.
So, sir,
okay, thank you. All right. Here's one here.
When Reagan and Gorbachev meet in Reykjavik, I think in 1986, they walk out of that meeting without having a formal agreement, I think. Mm-hmm. And I think part of that is because Reagan refuses to give up the SDI component. Mm-hmm. But what happens after that? What changes for Reagan and or Gorbachev to make the treaties possible after that?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. I even have a photo of that scene you're talking about right here in the photo section of the book. You know, it's a long book. If you don't feel like reading it, the pictures are pretty good. All right, so, okay, all right, so there you go. I know I threw a lot at you, but there's a lot I left out. And SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, is one of those. So thank you for that question. I didn't plant it, but it's a perfect question. So recall what I said about Reagan's defense buildup, that it's not just about outbuilding and outspending the Soviets, it's about outsmarting them and leveraging America's technological advantages and so on and so forth. The apotheosis of that, the climax of that is the Strategic Defense Initiative. This is his vision, his dream of using technology to build an elaborate missile shield that can shoot down incoming nuclear missiles launched against the United States. It is derided by its critics as Star Wars. Reagan himself, when he gives a speech announcing it, says, look, it'll take decades for us to develop this technology if we ever can. Hopefully it would come online by the end of the century, by the year 2000, he's thinking 17 years away. But for him, it is an effort to get out of this balance of terror in the Cold War, the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, that the Soviets have their 40,000 nuclear warheads targeted us, and we have our 30,000 targeted at them. Yes, that's how many there were. And the reason we can be secure knowing they're not going to launch against us is they know if they launch against us, we'll launch against them, and we'll together destroy the entire planet. He thought that was ludicrous. And he also knew that that puts you at risk of accident, of miscalculation, maybe of one side thinking you could get away with the preemptive first strike, all sorts of things wrong with that doctrine. And so he wants to break out of that. He says, well, how about, when he announces this to the country, how about instead of competing to kill and destroy lives, we compete to save them, right? How about instead of looking for more ways to destroy each other, we look for ways, compete in ways to protect each other. And that is the origins of the Strategic Defense Initiative. This terrifies the Soviets. They knew at the time that one of their areas of military advantage over the United States is their ICBM force, that they had so many more and more powerful ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are really big missiles than we did. And many of the Soviet leadership are very fascinated by American technology. Think, boy, those Americans, they invented the computer, right? They invented the telephone. Surely they can invent this missile shield. And so if you look, again, if you read all the transcripts of Reagan's meetings with Gorbachev is obsessed with SDI. He's doing everything he can to get Reagan to get rid of it. Now, the irony, or one of the complexities of this, is most American experts didn't think the thing would ever work, right? They think, this is nuts, right? There's no way you can shoot thousands of missiles out of the sky. And most scientific opinion said we'll never be able to do this. And Reagan says, well, let's at least try. So for him, it's only a vision. But Gorbachev worried that it actually could work, and that's why Gorbachev is so obsessed with it. So October of 1986, their second big summit at Reykjavik. They had started the summit by talking about, hey, maybe we each cut 50% of our nuclear arsenals. No such agreement had ever been more made in Cold War history. That in of itself would have been really dramatic. But then both of these guys are looking for a way out of this nuclear standoff, and so they keep trying to one-up each other on even deeper cuts. And then they say, well, how about we eliminate all of our missiles? And then Reagan says, well, let's just eliminate all of our nuclear bombs entirely, not just the missiles, but the bombs on our bombers. Our tactical ones. And so the world comes this close in October of 86 to an agreement to eliminate all nuclear weapons. It would have been really profound. Gorbachev, however, says there's one condition to go along with this, and that's you've got to confine your SDI research to the laboratory. I don't want you to actually test it. I don't want it to ever become deployed. And Reagan says, come on, that's the whole point. I want to have this system as a protection. He says, look, I'll trust that you Soviets will get rid of yours, but what about a madman? He even says, like, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Gaddafi later does try to get nukes, right? He says, what about if another rogue state? And Reagan would use the analogy, he said, even though we outlawed the use of poison gas and chemical weapons after World War I, we didn't get rid of all of our gas masks, right? He's saying, so don't make me give up this defense. And so Gorbachev says, fine, if you won't get rid of SDI, I don't trust you, and so the deal's off. And so that's why the summit collapses and they don't have a deal. But the question, and a very good question, is how is it that 6 months later, Gorbachev comes back and says, okay, now I'm ready to do a deal at least on those INF missiles. And the best evidence we have is this is where Reagan's pressure was actually working, right? And over the next 6 months, Gorbachev realizes we're just falling further and further behind in the arms race. Our economy really is a mess. CIA can't figure it out yet, but I Gorbachev, know that our economy is a mess. And Reagan deploying those intermediate range, those Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles in Western Europe, only 8 minutes flight time from Moscow. Gorbachev repeatedly calls, though, he says, those are like a gun pointed at our head, and those terrified him. And so he thinks, we had a really big deal on the table. We may not go back to that one, but I've got to come back and at least take this half a deal that we had. And so that seems to be what brings Gorbachev back. He's just feeling so backed into a corner by the pressure campaign. And again, Reagan, of course, has continued doing outreach to him, saying, hey, I still want to do the deal, right? I'm not giving that up. So he keeps both those prongs going. All right, another question. Augusta, whoever you want to. Oh, I'm that's scary. Okay, this one right here. All right, so. Okay.
One comment and one question. The other aspect of his policy that you didn't bring up was putting pressure on Soviet client states around the world.
The Reagan
and
doctrine.
particularly arming the Afghan Mujahideen, which kind of was a flip of what the Soviets did to us in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And of course, Gorbachev called Afghanistan a bleeding wound.
Mm-hmm.
But how much of Reagan's turn to diplomacy was really him, or was it the influence of George Shultz?
Okay. I first want to comment on the Reagan doctrine, then I'll come back to that. If you had me here for a few more hours, I would have spent more time on the Reagan doctrine. Very, very important. In brief, what it is providing American arms, weaponry, and economic aid to anti-communist fighters trying to eject a communist regime or overthrow a communist regime. It's supporting others to do their own fighting for themselves. It's what we're doing with Ukraine right now, frankly, right? The context for the Reagan doctrine is very important. Vietnam, right? What was one of the big takeaways from the Vietnam War? Don't send 500, 600,000 American ground troops to a faraway civil war with a communist element that turns into a bloody quagmire and a loss for us. So Reagan felt that very strongly. That's why even though he does the big defense buildup, he's actually very cautious and careful about deploying force. That's why the only time he does it in 8 years as president with ground troops is Grenada. But he also does not want to see communism still advance across the developing world, across the global south. And he knows that there's a lot of people in those countries who don't want that either, who want to fight against Soviet aggression or Soviet-sponsored aggression. Hence the Reagan doctrine of supporting anti-communist fighters in Cambodia, in Angola with the UNITA rebels, the Contras in Nicaragua, quite controversially, and of course the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Reagan's turn to diplomacy. How much is the influence of Shultz? Shultz, I make a case in my book, with apologies to a number of other great secretaries of state, for George Shultz being the greatest secretary of state since George Marshall, right? I am a very, very big fan of George Shultz. I think he is an indispensable and essential partner for Reagan in this diplomacy track, and frankly in the pressure track too. However, I think the turn to diplomacy, Shultz goes along with it, Shultz encourages it, but it's all Reagan. And it's from Reagan's first days in office, he wants to do diplomacy with the Soviets. He's just waiting for the right time. And Shultz, of course, is a very willing partner in this. But Shultz doesn't have to persuade Reagan to do this. Reagan had already wanted to go there. And I can give you a lot more detail on that afterwards if you want. So, yes, back here. So.
I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you. So growing up in the 80s, Reagan's persona was always a great communicator, very charismatic, but he did not get a lot of credit for intellectual depth. And tonight you have continued to say Reagan said this and Reagan said that.
Yeah.
To what extent was Reagan, intellectually engaging in these decisions, and to what extent was he just a great sort of team player and surrounded himself with really smart people that allowed him to say these things?
Yeah, very good question. And I will, I'm turning back to the photo section of my book to answer this, right? So, in my book, in the middle of the photo sections, I include an anti-Reagan poster from 1984. And I include this, and I'll tell you about the poster in a second, because I want people to be reminded of the intense hostility and criticism that Reagan engendered from his political opponents, but also from those who just thought he was an idiot, or just a B-movie actor who's now a B-level president who's just reading the cue cards that his crafty staff and Nancy's astrologer are having him do, right? I mean, okay, that's the character, okay? And so it's an unflattering photo of Reagan. He's doing this. It was a hot mic moment at a press conference where he said, "My fellow Americans, we begin bombing in 5 minutes." So he's making fun of him, the caricature of him as this nuclear-armed cowboy. And then it has an anagram of his name. You have to look carefully. His full name is Ronald Wilson Reagan, and the anagram, if you write this out on a cocktail napkin at dinner afterwards tonight, insane Anglo warlord. Like the letters in his name match up perfectly. Insane Anglo warlord, right? I hung that poster on my bedroom wall as a teenager in Arizona in the 1980s. That's what I believed, right? So I was one of those people who believed that very much about Reagan. I would say now as a rather uninformed teenager, but I remember very viscerally what it was like to hate this guy, to think he's a terrible president. I was a young man, much more of the left back then. Why did I revise my views so much? It's a longer story, but for purposes of your question, Reagan, there was a certain artifice to him of he liked being, as President George W. Bush, who I worked for, would say, misunderestimated, right? He had this plaque on his desk that said, "It's amazing how much you can get done in life if you don't care who gets the credit," okay? And he also knew that if his political opponents and his critics and if the Soviets think he's just this dim-witted lightweight who's reading the cue cards, that's a real advantage to his. So that's part of it. But also, it's now clear, certainly from the archives, and like I said, I spent about 10 years working on this book, so I've read quite a bit of the now declassified documents, his diary entries, that there was a much more sophisticated engagement with ideas and with the details of policies that he cared about than has been appreciated before. Everything from him personally rewriting a lot of his most notable speeches to detailed exchanges with his staff on the details of his negotiating posture with the Soviets, with Gorbachev going into these different summits and so on and so forth. But on other issues that he was less involved in or cared less about, he would read the cue cards that his staff gave him, right? He was a delegator. And frankly, to be an effective president, you have to be that, okay? So it's not completely false that at times he was not paying attention to the issues with just reading off the cue cards. But on the things that mattered to him, and I think the things that mattered to him were the really big picture issues, he was much more involved. And where I also got a lot of this is interviewing a lot of his former staff and top aides, and he said, "Oh yeah, Reagan knew his brief so well." Now he was a little more careful about how he revealed that in public, but behind closed doors, we all knew who the president was. So it's one of the things I love about history is oftentimes the initial snapshot we may think we get of a particular world leader, a particular president, may not be very accurate, and it's not till we can later kind of dig in and see what was really going on behind the scenes that we see a lot more. So thanks. So all right, we'll take one from right here. Yeah. So the room.
Would you be kind enough to comment on the chronology of his illness?
So, more particularly, did he have Alzheimer's while he was still in office?
Right.
Yeah. So most of you will know when he died in 2004, he died of Alzheimer's disease, a dreadful disease. And he publicly announced his diagnosis with Alzheimer's sometime in the fall of 1994. So about 6 years after he left the presidency. The question, and it's a difficult question, I'll give you my answer in a second, but for everyone else not familiar, is was there any onset of the Alzheimer's in his last year or two in office, 87 and 88? Because in those last couple of years, there's plenty of evidence in the historical record that he was, he was falling asleep in meetings sometimes, he was forgetting things sometimes. He certainly didn't have the same vigor and attention to detail that he did in 81, 82. I looked into this question quite a bit. I honestly did not have any preconceptions one way or another. As a non-medical doctor, right, my doctorate's in history, not medicine, my best provisional conclusion is no, he did not have Alzheimer's at all during the White House. And I'll tell you why. And this is, I'm getting the second or third hand, but I read the records of a number of his medical exams after he leaves the White House in 1989, 90, and 91. Okay, so he'd have his annual medical exam, several hours, very detailed workups and all sorts of stuff. No signs at all of Alzheimer's in those. So how do we explain that in 87 and 88, his last couple years in the White House, he's not as on top of things, he's not as energetic? Well, it's in some ways, I think it's a more simple, plain as day explanation. He was the oldest president in history at the time, 6 and 7 years into the hardest job in the world. I think about, as a younger, relatively vigorous guy, how tired I get and how all the things I'm forgetting these days. I think, wow, and I have nothing compared to what he did. And so it's clear that there were some of those lapses in the last couple of years, but I think it's more just he was really tired and old in a very difficult job. And when I keep referencing reading the transcripts of his meetings with Gorbachev, when it mattered, like in December of 87, in May of 88, when he was spending 3 or 4 days with Gorbachev, several hours a day going through these things, he would rise to the occasion, right? He would get that burst of energy. He would be in command of his brief. He'd be on top of the details. He wasn't having his lapses. Whereas if you really have Alzheimer's, you can't control or manage that as much. And so that's my best accounting for that. But I don't know for sure. So, all right. Okay, time for one more question. Sorry. All right. Let's do this one right here. Okay. Yeah.
Gorbachev has been quoted that Chernobyl was the straw that broke the camel's back for the Soviet Union. And what's your observation on Chernobyl and Gorbachev's comment about Chernobyl and what he said, the straw that broke the camel's back?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. So for those who don't know, April of 1986, the Soviet nuclear reactor providing a lot of energy to the southern part of the country in Chernobyl and what's now Ukraine has a catastrophic accident. The reactor core explodes. The recent miniseries of this is really good, by the way. I recommend it on HBO Max. And for months it unleashes clouds and clouds of this toxic radiation, kills thousands of Soviet civilians. The radiation clouds drift as far across the world over the Pacific Ocean, right, all across all 11 Soviet time zones, as well as into Western Europe. It's a catastrophic. It's the worst nuclear accident in modern history. What role does it play for Gorbachev and for the Soviet Union? For Gorbachev, he's been in office for 1 year and 1 month when Chernobyl happens. It's a couple of things. First, Gorbachev can't find out what's actually going on. His own staff, his own system keeps lying to him. And it turns out they're lying to him because they're lying to each other, right? Is nobody, it's all, that guy, oh, we did nothing wrong, that kind of stuff, all up and down the system. Then in turn, the initial Kremlin impulse, the press office and everything, is start lying to the rest of the world. And oh no, nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. Reagan actually realizes there's something wrong. Coincidentally, in April of '86, when Chernobyl happens, Reagan is flying across the Pacific, going to a G7 summit in Tokyo, and he's on Air Force One somewhere over the Western Pacific, and the teletype clatters, reports of some nuclear explosion in the Soviet Union, what's going on. When Reagan lands in Tokyo, and look at a map when you go home, this is very, very far from Ukraine. And they get off Air Force One, the Secret Service gets out their little, Geiger counter things, and they're detecting really high levels of radiation in Tokyo from the Chernobyl accident, right? So that's how bad this thing is. And so for Gorbachev, it is a shock to his system of realizing this entire political structure that I am presiding over, this one-party state, this communist totalitarianism, is just pretty rotten. It just doesn't work, and I can't even find out what is going on. And meanwhile, it is killing our own people, right? That's one of the big things for him. And that also, by the way, now the Reykjavik summit is several months later, and then in '87 is when Gorbachev decides to do a big nuclear deal. But it's clear also in hindsight that Chernobyl makes Gorbachev even more eager to do something to reduce the risk of nuclear war, because he sees, if there's even a peaceful nuclear explosion, just how toxic these things are. So Chernobyl is very important.
Yeah, and Chernobyl also gives Gorbachev the opportunity to purge his opponents.
Yes, yes, yeah.
You know, anybody who he didn't like, he could say, well, you didn't solve Chernobyl, so you're gone.
Yeah.
Never let a crisis go to waste.
Yes.
I want to finish with one question.
Okay.
It's a provocative question. Take it whatever
I
direction.
would expect nothing less.
Yeah, take it whatever direction you want.
Yeah.
Is the Republican Party in 2023 still the party of Reagan?
So, oh, that's not fair. That is not fair. All right. So anyway, well, I'm tempted to ask if the Democratic Party of 2023 is still the party of FDR. So anyway, I will say this. Yes and no, right? Okay, so on the one hand, most Republicans today, including many who were born after the Reagan presidency ended, right? Even the younger ones, if they're asked, who's your favorite president, who's the most successful president, who's an iconic Republican president, we'll say Reagan, right? So he still looms very large in the American political consciousness and the Republican political consciousness, and for pretty good reason, right? His failings were many, and you bring me back another night, and I'll talk about a lot of those too. I've given you the positive side tonight, but successful foreign policy, peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union, restoration of the American economy, the American spirit, leaves office with 65% approval ratings, and enjoys a very rare event in American political history, which is serving 2 terms and having your vice president be elected your successor, George H.W. Bush, who Jeff has written a great book on. Okay, so in that sense, it makes sense why Reagan would loom large. That said, if you look at a number of the policy convictions that Reagan had, commitment to allies, commitment to promoting human rights and democracy, commitment to free and open trade, trying to have a more optimistic and unifying message for the American people as both a policy and a communication strategy, those, are not necessarily the election-winning stands that most Republicans are taking these days. And so there's something of a deviation in a number of leading Republican policies than what Reagan actually stood for. And so that is something that the Republican Party today, they're not asking me for free advice, but I'll go ahead and give it anyway as still someone who is a Republican. There's a tension there, I think, that needs to be addressed. 2023 is a very different year, geopolitically, economically, and all that, than 1985 or whichever one we want to look at. But that said, when you have a relatively recent example of political and policy success like this, and still the biggest landslide re-election win in 1984 in political history, well, there's something said for learning from that. So, yeah. All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Let me encourage. Let me encourage 2 things before you depart. The first is, do pick up a copy of this book. I think that there's no one who has actually gone inside Reagan's head as well as your book. It's going to be the standard for years to come. Secondly, if you're interested in discussing these things in greater detail, our Article 2 Donor Society just had a book session, a book salon, discussing, reading, debating, engaging Will's book. And if you want to do some more history, check that out, because we have the opportunity for you to do so. Thank you for coming out tonight.
Okay, thank you very much.